Thank you for coming. Quite an exciting day after so many months of being closed. Today we reopened the exhibition of Tony Coates in a staggered manner, and it's been really moving, I have to say, to have people around. And thus I just really want to wholeheartedly thank you for joining us. According to the corona measures, this is a full house. And it's really, really very exciting. What we are doing tonight is we're trying in a kind of very rehearsal-y mode, see how we can train ourselves in local physical, and then what is the opposite of local? Non-local virtual co-presence, to launch this remarkable book, I believe, absolutely remarkable book, Deserting from the Culture Wars. My name is Maria Hlavajova. I'm artistic director here at BAK, and also on behalf of my team, one more time, welcome. It is my obligation to stress a couple of rules, or as we call them in the Netherlands, strict, strong recommendations. Please do wear face coverings at all times. Keep distance, we think not social, but physical distance, if possible. Wash your hands as often as you can. Respect the maximum of human bodies per section of the building. You will see that indicated throughout the building. For the use of toilets, I need to caution that per cluster, one person can use the cluster of toilets, and observe and operate the green-red door sign. This time around, we don't have smoking area. If you still smoke, please don't do it in front of the building, but at the end, either end of Pauwstraat. And in return, we promise to do our part, disinfect places as much as we can, as much as is necessary. And please note that this event is indeed photographed and streamed live. Now, as is clear, of course, we gather on the occasion of this wonderful publication, Deserting from the Culture Wars, which, rather than discussing the culture wars, is actually gathering a number of quite remarkable voices by artists and other thinkers to intervene in the contemporary conditions shaped by the culture wars. Now, the culture wars have been omnipresent for decades, of course, but in the 21st century, they have assumed a new prominence. Prominence in the form of a polarizing efficacy as a conduit, if you will, for the gradual normalization of an emerging far-right authoritarian world order. Now, as a significant portion of the globe slides into reactionary mode today, as we witness, battles around civil rights, social and ecological justice, health equity, racial hierarchies, gender identities, and, to be sure, truth. All these battles flood public discourse with a toxic brew of bewildering language, maximalist slogans, manipulative rhetoric, inflammatory imagery, conspiracy theories, and militarized posturing. Now, this one would think is a symbolic, quote-unquote, symbolic artillery deployed in the culture wars, yet to be sure, culture wars seamlessly entwine with other wars, class wars, civil wars, and active military hostilities. So I would think culture is not some abstract, not some distant terrain, but rather an ideological turf for all combat. And thus, to put it simply, where wars are being won and lost. and to today's acceleration by social media, culture warriors in a rapid succession, in extreme speed, fast-changing narratives, operating at many fronts at once. Culture wars seem to function like a sort of anesthetic, which disorients, which bewilders, which exhausts, and thus bringing before us, or maybe upon us, a very urgent question. How can we circumvent such totalitarian decoys? How can we organize differently, and how can we, in other words, be together otherwise? Now it is within these circumstances that Sven Lütticken, writer and curator and senior research advisor at BAK, has conceptualized this project, Deserting from the Culture Wars, which began long before we started to work on the book, also through a public editorial meeting, or if you will, a week-long trainings within the project, trainings for the not yet. All of this happening under the umbrella of BAK's long-term research itinerary called Propositions for Non-Fascist Living. Now, Sven conceives a tactical desertion as a way to actively evade the ever more polarized ideological culture combat waged in a theater of war, demarcated by the far right through aggressive hypersensitivity, injured entitlement, angry rants, and memes about culture Marxism, immigration, climate change, and feminism. Neither submission to nor an escape from these offensives, the notion of desertion builds upon the genealogy of flight and exodus as artistic and political practices. So this tactical desertion, the way I understand, is a way of not taking a bait, in a way, stepping aside from the divisive framing that culture wars set before us, and determining one's own conditions for practice that is collective, locally accountable, polyvocal, and multi-talented. In sync with artist and political activist Jean-Jacques Lebel's appeal to desert, but positively, seeking to circumvent the strictures of the state apparatus and engage in institutional practices instead, Sven asks, amidst the conundrum of today's culture wars, and I quote, what possibilities would be opened by a refusal to play these war games and commit desertion, not as a withdrawal into a realm of apolitical privacy, but as a pursuit of different strategies, tactics, and coalitions. Now, Sven will speak to these issues as an introduction to a conversation with Jonas Staal and Clara Balaguer, who will join us virtually in a minute. But before I hand over the microphone to him, or before he is allowed to take his own microphone, I would like to pronounce the words of thanks, specifically to contributors to the book: Bini Adamcha, Kader Attia, Rose Hammer, Tom Hollard, Geert Loving, Sven, Diana McCarthy, Dan McQuillan, Johannes Paureiter, Natasha Sadr-Hajijian, Esme Schoutens, Andreas Sikman, and Jonas Staal. I, of course, crucially owe my appreciation and admiration to Sven, who not only convened such a large collective conversation around this subject, but who has always shared his unending reservoir of knowledge and imagination with BAK in comradely solidarity. I also want to mention and thank Wietske Maas, associate editor of this publication, Irene Kalabuch-Miron, managing editor of the publication, and of course the entire team of BAK, as well as co-publisher of the publication, the MIT Press, and in particular Victoria Hindley. And this is the moment where I would like to hand over to you, Sven.
Thanks, Maria. Let me just test whether this works, whether the mic picks up my dulcet tones through the mask. If so, then I'll keep wearing it. Am I audible? Yeah? Okay, well, let me add to your thanks, Maria. Obviously, the contributors are to be thanked first and foremost, and you already did so. But the fact that this publication is here now under these grim circumstances in the fall of 2020 is due largely indeed to the incredible commitment of, let's say, the BAK machine, and by that I'm first and foremost, in the context of this publication, refer to Maria, as well as indeed Wietske Maas and Irene Kalabuch-Miron. This was really, yeah, quite incredible, the way that this publication was, I wouldn't say rushed through production, because that would suggest that it wasn't done very thoroughly and rigorously, but the we were on a very tight schedule from MIT Press, and I'm quite amazed that this has resulted in such a good, I think, publication under these circumstances within basically a few months. But yes, Maria has also already introduced the basic point of departure of the project. It is indeed an intervention. The title, of course, is a provocation, but I hope that it's more than just attention economy clickbait. Insofar as Deserting from the Culture Wars is a provocation, it is a propositional one, meant to help us, help me, refocus and ask basic questions about tactics. But I won't go into the whole history of the culture wars and the history of the concept of the culture wars, which would take us back at least to the Bush-Reagan era in the United States. But perhaps just very briefly, I would like to recap that the culture wars essentially started with a right-wing backlash against the emancipatory projects of the 60s and 70s. So the right-wing backlash against the Cultural Revolution. This generated the culture wars. The backlash against the New Left, feminism, LGBTQ rights or gay rights at the time, and decolonization. Of course, the way in which the culture wars are being framed on the right is different. It is usually the left that is accused of having started the culture wars through its desire to censor, to stifle free speech, or to impose its radical agenda on an unwilling public. And to be sure, progressives have at times been all too ready to play the part of the bogeyman, right? To play the part of social justice warriors at the right, as right-wing lingo has it. There is a fine line, I would say, between being one's enemy's worst nightmare, right? This is something one hears from time to time. I'm all too happy, right, to be your worst nightmare. There's a fine line between the enemy's worst nightmare and being the enemy's wet dream. And this is something that, you know, I keep being haunted by this question. In the early 1970s, Guy Debord noted that the left-wing terrorist groups of that period were in fact the state's perfect enemy, right? They were the perfect enemy to basically impose a state of exception, right? This was indeed tailor-made, let's say. If those right-wing terrorist groups did not exist, then they would have had to been created actively by the state, which is indeed to some extent what happened in a country such as Italy. Guy Debord is also fairly typical, I would say, in that he was a member of the 60s avant-garde, of the neo-avant-garde, who was quite obsessed, we might say, with military jargon and military concepts, right? The avant-garde itself is, of course, a military notion, the vanguard, and Debord and the Situationists tended to see social conflict and revolutionary action through a military lens. Debord was a devotee of Clausewitz and a designer of a war game, and so on. Now, if Debord usually sought the offensive in any conflict, another veteran of May 68 sounded a very different note in a 1977 text. Maria has already mentioned Jean-Jacques Lebel, who is in fact close to Kader Attia, one of the contributors to this project. And you can spot his photo in the book if you look carefully. And so in 1977, Jean-Jacques Lebel wrote a scenario for a happening titled Strategy for Victory, in which he proposes, and I quote, to abandon that which is confining, destructive, or negatively repetitive, to open up that which creates and increases autonomy, to put one's energies and desires into a social position for the production and exchange of subversive and non-suicidal intensities, to desert but positively. End of quote. Now this text is informed by Deleuze and Guattari, to whom the bell was close, and by the rise of post-operaist autonomism. And Guattari himself was, of course, closely following developments in Italy, the rise of autonomia in Italy. In this context, in this 1970s context, Deleuze and Guattari inspired notions of flight, of exodus and desertion came to feature heavily in activist and artistic discourse. Deleuze himself quoted one of the imprisoned Soledad brothers in the United States, George Jackson. I quote, "I may take flight, but all the while I'm fleeing, I will be looking for my weapon." Right? This is the quote that's at the origin of the Deleuzean rhetoric of lines of flight. So this is also a kind of active desertion or positive desertion, a flight in the course of which one is looking for a weapon. This link to George Jackson is also actually a reminder of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have argued, that autonomism, I quote, has a depth at a distance to the black radical tradition. In Autonomia, Moten and Harney write, in the militancy of post-workerism, there is no outside. Refusal takes place inside and makes its break, its flight, its exodus from the inside. So here we also hear we can pick up on the Deleuzean overtones in Moten and Harney's gloss on the tactics of autonomism. Now, as Maria has already mentioned, we do not conceive of the culture, right, as in the Culture Wars, as an autonomous domain, as a pure superstructure grafted onto social reality or onto the productive relations. The culture wars have always the potential to turn violent, and indeed they are violent. They can become a matter of life and death, as physical violence and acts of murder and terrorism are legitimized and sometimes triggered by alt-right culture warriors, from Anders Breivik in Norway to recent shooting sprees in mosques or shisha bars in Germany, to violence against LGBTQ people in Bolsonaro's Brazil, for instance. The culture wars indeed shape, break, and end lives. Therefore, the sense of urgency and constant alarm is all too understandable. Nonetheless, I would say there is a danger of slipping into a purely reactive mode, of becoming a twitching bundle of Pavlovian reflexes. How to be the enemy that the right needs, rather than the enemy that the right so clearly wants, so clearly desires. This question is indeed still haunting me, you might say. I invited a number of brilliant people to help to at least begin to flesh out this line of questioning. If I had all the answers, then I would have just written a book. But this project is very much not about me having all the answers. Tonight, we will continue the conversation. We will continue the discussion with one contributor to the book and one additional voice that I'm very excited about including. So first, we will have Jonas Staal, who indeed did a training session last November and who is represented in the book. And then after Jonas, we will have Clara Balaguer, who is, let's say, a print-based artist, activist, organizer from the Philippines, but based in Rotterdam, as is Jonas. And I think there will be other resonances as well between their talks. For instance, the central role that Facebook plays in the projects they will be discussing. So first we will have Jonas on the other front lines that we may be able to open up in this act of positive desertion. He will discuss infrastructural activism, in particular his collectivized Facebook project, I believe. So yes, Jonas and Clara are both with us on Zoom or some platform. And Jonas, the floor is yours.
Hey, good evening. Sven, Maria, Clara, everyone who's watching. Can you hear me well in the space? Great. So in short response to the book, Sven already gave already a general introduction to the title, Deserting from the Culture Wars, the book that Sven and Maria edited together. And already from the first moments that we started discussing this title in the context of some live BAK events, seems a long time ago, but there was a time in which the space you see now was actually occupied by more than 2 physical, real existing humans. There were already some misinterpretations, because somehow deserting from the culture wars, this term deserting seems to be immediately associated with escaping. So the interpretation becomes escaping from the culture wars, or hiding from the culture wars, or ignoring the culture wars. Although obviously there's little escapist about the approach of both the editors and various of the contributors to this book. Rather, the title, in length of Sven's introductions a moment ago, the title provokes another question: where are we deserting to? And I would also love to refer to the introduction of Maria, but there were some real technical difficulties on the background. So we were not able to follow the entire first part of the event, unfortunately. So the title provokes another question: where are we deserting to? What actual front lines become visible when we refuse to play by the dominant rules and narratives of the so-called nationalist international? And then we can think of the new authoritarian world order that includes Duterte, Modi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump, all of its fascist travelers in Europe, ranging from the Dutch and Austrian so-called freedom parties to the Orban and law and justice regimes in Hungary and Poland. Now, Bini Adamzak, one of the contributors to the book, she made clear during an earlier gathering around these questions at BAK in Utrecht that of course we have stakes in the culture wars, even though it has been scripted and, as Sven also emphasized, turned all too real into all too real-time violence by our opponents. A culture war that supposedly pits white Christian economic nationalism on one hand against so-called cultural Marxists, genderists, and the Party of Davos on the other. Party of Davos referring, of course, to the annual Davos summit of the 1% in Switzerland. Now, Bini, in that light, spoke of the importance of the online Antifa movement, the online anti-fascist movement, the left-wing digital troll militia that counter the alt-right on message boards and comment sections to ensure that we maintain a stake in the platforms that the alt-right has been systematically appropriating at a rapid pace. But simultaneously, we cannot be caught endlessly in the tropes of our enemies. We won't win a war that was made for us to lose. We desert from these culture wars because we have to establish our own front lines or recognize real-time existing front lines, our own narratives and organizations to ensure the possibility of a transformative politics and the creation of egalitarian forms of life. Now, in the coronavirus pandemic, we have witnessed not only a biological virus, but also a rapidly spreading virus of egalitarian ideas. We could call it a red virus. I wrote about it in my own contribution to the book titled Contagion Propagations. The world might not have witnessed for some time so many as in the past months. Essential workers and their demand for fair pay, cleaners, care workers, educators, delivery workers have been heralded. Universal basic income suddenly showed itself to be the absolute rational minimum policy, the minimum demand, and neoliberal governments saw themselves forced to engage in public investments that would have made Thatcher scream from the beyond. This emerging socialized imaginary provides an important opportunity to establish a different front line, to overcome the primacy of extractivist private property for that of one of collective ownership and collective care. But the expression of the red virus in the form of this collective desire for collectivity, as Jody Dean phrased it, will not by definition translate to the urgent demands for climate justice through a decolonial Green New Deal, the demands for colonial reparation and planetary redistribution, the demand for equal access to healthcare, education, culture, the need for representational quota, the demand for workers' control over trillion-dollar companies. The opportunity the red virus provides us if it's not organized upon and if it's not worked for, can turn dark and fuel nationalist sentiments, as is happening in the Netherlands right now, where the dangerous racist narrative is being pushed by the ultranationalist Freedom Party, the PVV, that Dutch citizens with a migrant background would be disproportionately occupying ICU beds. While, of course, the truth is that many Dutch citizens with a migrant background are disproportionately represented in dangerous, low-paid, essential contact labor. And if there is such a thing as an overrepresentation, which should be a term that is not even used in the context of urgent care, that is a result of the essential work that they are providing to this society. So there is a great urgency in furthering the propagation of the red virus. And here I believe that art and cultural work has an important contribution to make by building on this collective desire for collectivity and to visualize, to narrate, to agitate for the possibility of egalitarian forms of life. Now, to give you an example from my own practice, in March this year, as the pandemic began to spread, I was supposed to launch a pre-trial of a lawsuit against Facebook, titled Collectivize Facebook, that I developed in the year before together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon, and Sven references this also in introduction in his book. In this book, the Collectivize Facebook lawsuits we have been forced to wage digitally over these past months, during which we have all become even more dependent on trillion-dollar companies like Facebook and Amazon. And if we are saying everybody in this case, we are talking about a partial everybody, those who have the relative privilege to access these platforms like Facebook in the first place, who have high optic fiber cable networks at their disposal, which is not evident at all. These trillion-dollar companies, Facebook, Amazon, in the meantime, have presented their best quarter numbers in a lifetime. It essentially proves that our catastrophe is essentially their capital. Now, the core argument that lawyer Jan Vermon and me bring forward in our indictment is that Facebook fundamentally undermines the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals as it is enshrined in Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations. We argue that the right to self-determination is undermined by Facebook, by the property form of Facebook, amongst others, because it has turned users into unpaid data workers. Our production of data, the production of data through our affective labor, is Facebook's capital, is the source, the essence of its income model. Facebook undermines the right to self-determination because it infringes upon our privacy, it enables mass surveillance, it disproportionately impacts democratic elections, for example, through the back-end doors that it allows companies like Cambridge Analytica to use to influence various elections across the world. And Facebook actively advises various authoritarian regimes across the world. So our subsequent demand in response to this structural violation of the right to self-determination on various fronts is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain. To have Facebook recognized as a public domain and have its ownership transferred to its 2.5 billion active users. That doesn't mean to nationalize Facebook, it means to cooperatize Facebook, to reclaim transnationalism from racial capitalism and establish a transnational cooperative under collective governance of 2.5 billion owners, not just users, owners. And of course, this in itself has precedent. There are many private initiatives, historically speaking, that at some moment were recognized as having such a disproportionate impact on public well-being, and that a form of corporatization was inevitable. We can think of the trash disposal systems, fire brigades, even though we have come to a point in time where, for example, in the US, fire brigades have been re-privatized to serve the rich, whereas it is prison detainees who are supposed to protect the rest of the population for $1 a day, risking their lives. Of course, in 2008, we temporarily nationalized banks, and most recently, the Podemos-led government in Spain nationalized the private healthcare system, at least for the time being of the pandemic. After we file our lawsuit, the lawsuit against Facebook, we will file Ivan. And for those interested, you can read the full indictment on collectivize.org, and this is also where you can join as co-claimant in this lawsuit. After we file our lawsuit against Facebook, of course, other trillion-dollar companies should be next. Amazon, Bayer that owns Monsanto, Alphabet that owns Google. For all of these trillion-dollar companies were created through publicly funded research, publicly funded mail services, publicly funded unpaid data work. We essentially worked for it, we paid for it, and now we should own it. This, for Jan and me and the thousands of co-claimants that have joined us since the launch of our collective action lawsuit, is an urgent front line to desert to. A front line in the struggle against the primacy of extractivist private property and the necessity to enforce common sense of the common sense of collective ownership and collective care. And of course, the work that I do with Jan is only a minor example, an attempt from the artistic and legal field, combining artistic and legal imaginations to contribute to the propagation of the red virus. But such examples alone can of course not account for the structural scale of organization that a new paradigm of planetary politics demands. In that light, it is important, as a last comment, to mention the Progressive International. The Progressive International, a new transnational coalition of progressive political parties, indigenous peoples, unions, social movements that was launched in the midst of the pandemic with the aim of providing structural support to progressive causes across the world. And when I read this announcement of the Progressive International that came into being exactly at the moment where it seemed that we needed it the most, but it was absent, and when I read and encountered the vast and diverse coalition and also the different forms of organization that make up Progressive International, from First Nations to social movements, political parties, I was really moved. I felt moved by the possibility of an intimacy that is not the bodily intimacy of the public assembly or protest that Afina Afanasiou and Judith Butler have written so powerfully about. But it spoke to another kind of infrastructural intimacy, a sense of nearness and a sense of closeness that exists in such an organization at such a scale without possibly ever meeting face to face, while still being connected in common cause, in common purpose, through, in this case, the transnational party form. And that is not to say that there's not great importance and urgency in the bodies that appear on squares and streets in performative assembly, as they still do, whether it relates to the anti-terror, so-called anti-terror bill in the Philippines, or whether it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement. These are essential because they, amongst others, following the work of Afanasiou and Butler, pre-enact new common imaginaries. They build from a sense of collective threat to the possibility of living a livable life, brings together unexpected alliances and pushes for the necessity of fundamental transformational change. But there is similar great importance and urgency in a scaled infrastructural nearness that enables planetary crackdowns on tax evasion, the jailing of hedge fund managers, bankers, and authoritarians, that enforces to maintain common ownership over water and air, and ensuring its equal access and distribution, to begin what Naomi Klein has termed the years of repair for a new paradigm of planetary comradely care, deserted from the culture wars because there are many real worlds to win.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I realized I've done a really shitty job at introducing the both of you. I'm totally out of practice when it comes to moderating, clearly. It's been almost a year since I've done anything like this. I hope that the people who didn't know who Jonas is just Googled Jonas quickly while he was speaking, but then who doesn't know Jonas Staal? Thank you very much for this presentation about collectivized Facebook, about the Progressive International, about these various infrastructural activities. You mentioned Bini Adamczak's discussion of indeed responses, online responses to trolls, forms of counter-trolling, which I think is a really good link to Clara's presentation. Clara has indeed a background in design, in publishing, in print, in printed matter, but she also has been very active in trolling the trolls in the Philippines, with kind of organizing a sort of collective troll farm or a counter troll farm. And we are going to see your pre-recorded presentation now, right? And then afterwards you'll join us again for the discussion. So Clara's contribution has been pre-recorded, and I suppose we can start that now.
So I'm sitting in the dark in my bedroom at 2 in the morning and chain smoking and vaguely lit by the computer screen to try and demonstrate a little bit the context and conditions under which for close to 3 years I was carrying out research into toxic online political campaigning. And I did this I approached this as an autoethnographic experiment, and autoethnographic in the sense that I didn't just want to observe online trolling, I wanted to become part of it and observe it from the inside. And I had to embody, or I did, I embodied the persona and later on inhabited this role of the online ideological white hat troll. So basically, I was a troll hunter. And to hunt your enemy, you must be your enemy. And I'm very interested in how the right has so successfully co-opted strategies, discourse, and even values of the progressive left so effectively and much, and how to reverse this reverse this flow and how to study the alt-right in the Philippines. You can't really call it the alt-right, but that's another story. How to pay back with the same coin and try to extrapolate from their practices the core of what makes them so emotionally effective and emotionally rewarding. There is a wellness factor within alt-right strategy that can be gleaned, I think, and that can be separated from the politics in the same way that the right did that with strategies and tools and discourse from the left. It's that same approach can be used against them. And it was important for me to embody, to feel the effects of what participating in toxic online discourse did to me on a very physical level, and from this place of deeply embodied knowledge, try to come up with tactics to counteract the toxicity that I was involved in. And it challenges this idea of the ethnographer as the observer, and it is embedded research. I guess it is fully embedded research. And when I say research, it's research in quotation marks because I'm not an academic. I am not an anthropologist. In fact, I only have a high school diploma. I am an autodidact and a vernacular actor. I am a layperson. And for me, it's always interesting to try and approach these complex social problematics or complex issues from the standpoint of a layperson. And how could I, as a citizen with no technical knowledge of how to organize and launch a concerted online counterattack, how could I enter these online spaces and reverse engineer through observation how people were using the platform and how the platform, or the platform in question being Facebook, how these online platforms, what are the opaque rules that govern behavior, and how can you figure out how to work within those rules and trick the system, basically. So I think I mentioned I had 2 targets, or I'm not sure because I've tried to record this message several times. But anyway, I have 2 targets, misogynists and supporters of authoritarian President Rodrigo Duterte. So Rodrigo Duterte is the president of the Philippines who was elected in 2016, has become world famous for many things, amongst them a predilection for extrajudicial killings, for very toxic misogynist comments, incendiary comments, and he is called, erroneously called the Trump of Asia, but actually Donald Trump should be called the Duterte of the United States or North America, or maybe even the West. Duterte's political career predates Trump by 22 years. He was the mayor of a city in the south of the Philippines called Davao for 22 years, and also he got elected before Trump. I would like to propose this resituation of the ground zero. I think in many in many texts that I've read, or in discourse that is being created about the issue of like online toxicity and culture wars, it's quite dominated by Western voices who think that ground zero is Trump, or ground zero is like different sorts of like alt-right and fascist resurgence in Europe, but that's not ground zero. Ground zero is the Philippines and places like the Philippines. So Christopher Wiley, the whistleblower of Cambridge Analytica, gave an interview to Maria Ressa, who is a famous like a online investigative online journalist who runs this news outlet called Rappler, that is one of the news outfits that was most critical against Duterte. And right now Maria Ressa is actually facing quite a lot of government pushback and persecution. She's been arrested several times, so yeah, she has paid a price for her for holding the line, and she has taken a specific interest in how, because Rappler is an online news portal, she has taken a very specific interest in how toxicity and misinformation, disinformation is playing out online. So in an interview that Christopher Wiley gave to Maria Ressa, God, it's exhausting to have to provide so much context, but yeah, I'm doing it because I understand that this may be unfamiliar. But anyway, so in the interview that Christopher Wiley gave to Maria Ressa, he said, "Don't you think it's curious that Donald Trump looks a lot like Rodrigo Duterte?" And basically what he was saying is that the Philippines was a petri dish of Cambridge Analytica, a place where they could try out different strategies and see what worked. And when they found different tactics and strategies that were effective, they could very easily port that into other markets. And he was actually saying that when like the scandal, the Cambridge Analytica kind of scandal, of like all of the data that they had mined to make these like targeted political disinformation campaigning. When you look at the data, he said the two countries where the most information was mined was number one, the United States, and number two, the Philippines. And he was saying that the Philippines is an ideal testing ground for outfits like Cambridge Analytica for many reasons. The two reasons that he mentioned were the fact that the country has a very lax rule of law, and therefore if you come up with, if you do kind of extra legal things, it's very easy to evade accountability. And there's also very high internet penetration. So in the Philippines, internet for many, many people is synonymous to Facebook. So if you remove connection via Facebook from the equation or from the statistics, then the number of the rate of internet penetration goes down drastically. Now this is because Facebook in the Philippines is free. In 2013, on the back of three very, very intense disasters, the first one being a super typhoon in the north, the second one being an earthquake in the central area of the Philippines in the Visayas, and then the third being a siege, an attempted takeover, guerrilla takeover of a city in the south of the Philippines called Zamboanga. These three disasters happened one on top of the other in the span of a very few months, and in response to this large-scale humanitarian crisis, Mark Zuckerberg decided to give the Philippines free Facebook under the guise of helping with disaster relief efforts. He sent drones because, of course, there was after like typhoons and earthquakes, there's no internet connection, and you need to map out the extent of the disaster, where there are possible survivors, etc. So he gave us free Facebook and internet connection for this purpose. Free Facebook stayed. And in the Philippines, you can, with a phone that has no data plan, you can still access the internet via Facebook. So what that means is that the Agora for political opinion making on the Philippines is this platform. I think in Brazil, it was kind of a bit more vehiculated on Bolsonaro's campaign, was like, galvanized by WhatsApp. In the Philippines, it was Facebook. Also another reason that makes, and I don't think Wiley didn't mention this in his interview, another reason that makes the Philippines a really interesting breeding ground for corporately organized troll farms, essentially, is the fact that there is already this existing know-how, thanks to the Philippines being a business process outsourcing center for the world, or a BPO center for the world, which means call centers or like outsourced programming and coding work, a little bit like India. But I think the Philippines has cheaper labor than India, if I'm not mistaken, at least in like the tech industry. And also our English is a bit more malleable. We're quite good at mimicry. And so call centers actually train Filipino employees to have American accents and even to pretend like they live in like cities like Texas. So there is this existing economy and know-how of how to run a large-scale BPO company, essentially. What's interesting, I think, so the Philippines is ground zero, not just for like it's a breeding ground also for a certain there are certain cultural specificities or personality traits of kind of non-conforming actors that are actually quite well situated and prepared for engaging in the culture wars. and specifically I would refer to like two communities: the queer community and the neurodivergent community. So people with ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, like, yeah, the neurodivergent. In a research paper by Jonathan Corpus-Ong and Jason Cabanas, which was published under a research kind of fund of of UMass, or the University of Massachusetts, and something called Newton Tech for Dev. Who knows what that is? CIA, I don't know. So it was called The Architects of Network Disinformation. And in this paper, they were doing like a lot of interviews with different respondents that belong to troll farms within the Duterte campaign. And one interesting kind of discovery was that a lot of the employees of these companies were queer and trans. I believe the term that they used to refer to these workers was the purple collar workforce. And so the fact that code switching is an inherent, many times or quite, almost invariably a part of the queer experience. This prepares you uniquely for being able to manage multiple accounts of multiple genders and personalities comfortably. So it's this idea of a gender nonconformity as a special talent. When I was trolling, for example, I trolled in different personas and genders, but I found the dysphoria to be a bit uncomfortable. And so in the end, I for many reasons, but one of them being this discomfort, this dysphoric discomfort of being identified as another gender. So I would mostly troll as myself and as a woman. I also felt it was important to understand, because women are, huge targets of online toxicity. So I felt like it was important to inhabit the most problematic position and the largest target position. But anyway, so it's quite interesting actually that Duterte's kind of top three troll, like a high level troll supporters or propagandists. One of them is a openly, proudly gay man. The second one is this sort of lipstick feminist sexy dancer, like a reproductive health rights advocate, so a feminist. And the third one is actually a transgender scholar of, I don't know, international relations or something, interestingly enough, educated at Leiden University and currently teaching as a history teacher at Maastricht University. So the top triangle, or the top of the pyramid of his online propagandists, is a queer constellation. It's interesting how Duterte plays with code switching as well. So despite being openly misogynist and making like openly misogynist and fascist and making like apology for like Hitler and the final solution and stuff like that, that so many of his supporters are queer and what I guess in the West would be identified as like liberated feminist women. It's a repeat of the appeal that Imelda Marcos had for the queer community in the Philippines. So she's still very much like a political and fashion and pop culture icon for many queer folk. And Imelda has actively Imelda being, sorry for not providing context, but Imelda Marcos being the wife of Ferdinand Marcos, who was a dictator of the Philippines from the 1970s, the martial law period from 1971 to 1986. Wife of dictator. There is this history already in the Philippines of a sort of queer fascism in a way, which Duterte and Imelda were quite adept at courting this very, very powerful, not just a voting bloc, but also a bloc for mobilizing political opinion. So another one of the kind of talents or the advantages, and not just being like the ability to sock puppet different accounts without discomforting dysphoria, but also because queer language, what we call now Becky or Beckinese or Becks, queer language and queer culture really dominates sort of Philippine media and culture. Queerness is more or less is quite socially accepted. I'm not saying that there's no struggles for queer people in the Philippines, but yeah, I mean, compared to, let's say, another Spanish post-colonial country, or like Brazil or Mexico, where it's really is much more dangerous to be openly trans or queer. In the Philippines, it's a bit more accepted, and yeah, and the effects or the power that they have on popular culture, and the way that they dominate popular language and how they are able to seed political opinions in this very kind of snarky and appealing and funny way actually made them excellent astroturfers. The other community I think that's quite interesting is a group of people that I've been working with on Wikipedia, which is another sort of front line for combating historical negationism, specifically around the figures of Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos, because their family, despite this crazy history of like corruption and dictatorship and bloodshed and torture and persecution, they're actually they strategized a resurgence and a washing and a revisionism, a nefarious revisionism of Philippine history. And one of the battlegrounds for this is Facebook. And what's interesting in like the work that I've been doing with these Wikipedia activists for a few years is that a lot of them, or yeah, a lot of them seem either profess neurodivergence, or yeah, there is one of my friends says, well, you know, I have OCD, so that makes me uniquely fit for doing all of this very, very obsessive and nitty-gritty editing wars on Wikipedia. So yeah, I think the Philippines, like this idea of resituating the gaze and where should we be looking for to see alternative strategies for engaging in the cultural wars rather than deserting them. Or maybe it's a matter of deserting the Western cultural wars and redirecting attention, funding, discourse making, and exchange to places like the Philippines that are ground zero. And sorry, I've talked a lot, but yeah, we can talk more in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to both of you, and well, thanks also to Clara for this layered presentation with spoken discourse and then also self-trolling subtitles. That was very, very rich, I would say. And yeah, no doubt there's a lot of scope here for discussion, and I hope we will also be getting a lot of questions from the physical audience and from the online audience, let's say. Perhaps to start us off, and yeah, in relation to both of you basically, but perhaps also first and foremost a little relatively sort of banal perhaps and down-to-earth question for Clara. In your subtitles at a certain point you did talk about, or you did mention this kind of collective troll farm, white hat troll farm that you organized. You also mentioned in your spoken discourse the, let's say, the dominant troll farms, which are companies, right? So that's basically a corporate troll farm. Could you perhaps say a few things briefly about the setup that you used, because you are indeed not just doing this on your own, albeit using different identities and getting gender dysmorphia, but how was, let's say, the troll farming itself collectivized and organized?
Well, it was organized in different ways. First, I sort of ended up in a troll hunting group on Facebook. So like friends of friends and concerned citizens, and we started trolling together. Using the Facebook group as like a headquarters and alerting each other to certain feeds that we thought were necessary to engage in. And then we would, if there was anybody available, then we would sort of go in packs. And when I remember one particular time we did it quite intensely, there were quite a few of us, and it was like this feeding frenzy and this creative frenzy. We were like trolling in the feeds, and then we were chatting with each other, and we had like a game going, like who could have the best comment. We ended up making a comic strip. Like it was really this just joyful activity, which is so different from the solitary trolling. So based on, I don't know if this came first or if I also organized different like meetings at my house. So getting people together. No, yeah, it was the Facebook group first, because then I invited some of them to my home. And we were trolling together, and it was, yeah, there was this sense of community and like no sense of anxiety. I mean, the difficulty with the trolling was the physical toll that it took on my body and on my personal life. So it became clear that to do it together was an antidote in a way. So later on, I started kind of prototyping different experiments, some on Twitter as well. The one on Twitter I did with my daughter was like 24-hour running a hive, basically, based on, with different accounts that were based on this idea of the hive. So there was the queen, there was the drones, there was the workers, and there was the nurses. And each different account had a certain role to play. And then I did it within the context of a graphic design school. So actually, this is the first time that we call it troll palayan. Palayan meaning rice paddy. So you cannot harvest rice on your own. Harvesting of rice must be done with your family, with your neighbors. So yeah, it was this different idea of gathering. And that was really quite interesting. But yeah, that was already in a Canadian, like North American context. But I think, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. I think that sort of clarifies a lot about the modus operandi. Let's see, Maria, would you like to?
Yeah, I wanted to turn to you with one question, and that's what Clara brought up: Western culture wars. How do you relate to that? And then I have a question for Jonas as well. So I'm interested to hear how you reacted to that.
Yeah, clearly this is one of the interesting aspects and one of the I suppose challenges of Clara's contribution. This shift, right, to the Philippines as ground zero. I think that's that's a lot to process and to think about. Let's say clearly this poses also significant challenges to Western conceptions of fascism, right, that are based on certain genealogies and that see fascism as something that, of course, responds to sort of a crisis in colonialism and imperialism, right, in the early 21st century, and it's something that responds to a crisis in the, let's say, system of global capitalism, which is extractivist and neo-colonial and neo-imperialist, etc., in the early 21st century. And then, you know, it emerges in, let's say, in the metropolis, in the centers of the West, right? But so what indeed if we shift this attention, and what if, what if contemporary fascism is something that was, for instance, tested, right? Clara, I think at some point also mentioned that, Cambridge Analytica did a kind of trial run basically in the Philippines.
A petri dish.
Yeah, the Philippines as a petri dish. Right? Yeah. What does that mean? I mean, I don't have a ready-made answer. I think, you know, this is something to take on board. I think in a way, the publication, the Culture Wars book, is quite, in a way, happily provincial, in that, you know, all the practitioners are basically more or less based in Europe, you know, whatever their backgrounds are and whatever sort of post-colonial histories they embody, right? But they're all based in Europe to some extent, and they all face the European version of contemporary fascism, which leads to, you know, generates a certain focus, right? It gives the book a certain focus that I think is good. But then you also need this kind of counterpoint, right? A follow-up project would have to indeed question and provincialize this focus, if you will.
But I think it also demonstrates how traditional, if I may use the term, I don't know what to replace it with, but political geographies actually dominate the conversation in that respect. And I think related to that, I want to turn to Jonas. Jonas, I see you on two screens. I don't know which camera corresponds to that. I'd love to look you in the eyes, so herewith, somehow.
Oh yeah, the other one, yes.
Oh my goodness, Jonas. So the idea of progressive internationalism. So I have certain misgivings about the notion of internationale, of course. It throws me back into the 20th century, so I wanted to challenge that notion of progressive internationale in present. But other than that, okay, this is turning me around somewhere, Jonas, somewhere. So the most important question I did want to ask, essentially, was how to understand that notion of ideological intimacy you were gesturing towards. So what is this infrastructure of progressive internationale? Maybe there is a better term for internationale, but for now. How is that ideological intimacy across distance actually mediated? Because I fear it's mediated by tech platforms such as Facebook, and then we're back, you know, in a vicious circle to, don't want to use the term ground zero, but back to where we began with. So these are kind of two questions, the careful misgivings around the term of internationale, and throughout the editing of the book we were playing with various terms: internationale, transnationale, terrestrial, as Sven brought up in one of his brilliant essays. Can we think ourselves out of that kind of old-fashioned kind of reliance on nation states, essentially? And then the notion of ideological intimacy across distance, which is not physical intimacy, but intimacy mediated otherwise. But I don't quite know how to understand it, and I want to, because as we've just entered the age of pandemics, we need to figure it out somehow.
Nice to be with you, Maria.
Happy to see you again.
In this strange way, very happy to see you. I also have to say, I had some challenging minutes, because the moment that Sven referenced the subtitles in Clara's video, I realized I didn't see any subtitles. So I started to rewatch the video while she was answering Sven's questions and reading the subtitles. So I feel trolled in a very positive sense of the.
Well done, Clara.
But probably I understood now. I understood her contribution in a slightly too singular way from the kind of first 10 minutes of subtitles that I've now been able to see. Of course, Maria, in relationship to the term progressive international, we're dealing with two terms that are both in some sense, well, how shall we say it? Vintage, retro, deeply problematic. Progress towards what? And the primacy of progress is, of course, exactly what has driven the kind of the extractivist, neo-colonial extractivist dynamics that have brought us to the catastrophes that we're facing now. International, of course, might not necessarily refer to, or in traditional, I would say in the history of the left, doesn't necessarily relate to nation state, but to nationhood and the recognition of cultural difference and specific genealogies while trying to articulate them in a common project. But I mean, I agree, the cosmopolitical, the planetary, the terrestrial, there's a whole series of terms that might as terms, as concepts already provoke other forms of transnational or planetary organization that we need, leaving this 20th century vocabulary behind. At the same time, what emerged in the period of the pandemic, what was announced, what was launched, was the Progressive International. So at some point, I also feel we work with the tools that we have. I would also probably have thought of another term, and many others would as well. But at some moment, there are people who organize and provide the possibility of a new, I didn't say ideological intimacy, but infrastructural intimacy. And infrastructural intimacy is something that I thought about a lot in the period of the pandemic, specifically because of its general lack, its general absence, the general incapability of nation states to privilege public health over economic continuity. And then the very rare examples like the Podemos-led government, which is the product of the Los Indignados movement that struggled for a period of 10 years from 2011 onwards to not only work on the streets, but have a parallel stake in parliament, and was capable of of enforcing universal basic income in the period of the pandemic, and is fighting for it to last after the pandemic, to use this moment of transformation to create new forms of infrastructural intimacy, structures that enforce redistribution, enforce equal representation without this continuously falling back to individual choice. Am I willing to be solidary with you? Am I willing to share? I feel that this let's say liberal take, this liberal primacy that we're dealing with in the period of the pandemic is unacceptable, because questions of redistributions and equal access, whether it is to healthcare or culture or education, or questions of colonial reparations, shouldn't be questions of discussion, but of structural mechanisms that are subjected to checks and balances that enforce these policies into being, and create through this infrastructure, through this shared infrastructure, intimacies that I felt deeply lacked, that I felt deeply absent in this period of time, in which everything falls back into some kind of NGO-ish. Are individuals willing to do something for someone else? And that is not what it should be about. So in that sense, I absolutely believe that we need an international, an infrastructural, a cosmopolitical, a planetary.
Can I jump in?
Definitely, go on.
Yeah, I also actually, when you were talking, Jonas, I was like writing down, and I also kind of circled around this kind of idea of intimacy, and you called it infrastructural intimacy, and at one point you also talked about scaled infrastructural nearness, and I wrote down like like this mediated intimacy is actually like it is a purely intellectual and emotional connection that you have online that can be removed from the distracting chemistries, the bodily chemistries that interfere with our ability to connect in our most essential forms. So I do believe that there is another form of intimacy that is created online, that, and there's a reason why marginalized or non-normative communities, such as that there's a reason why they find liberation online with this kind of disembodied form of intimacy. And now when you were talking about, to jump to this idea of like geographical, like a geographical international, I was thinking of the archipelagic, archipelagic formations. And we had a radio broadcast just yesterday, actually, with a group of anarchists, different anarchist organizers in the Philippines, who were worrying and picking at, well, worrying in the sense of picking at it, this idea of forms of governance, structures, and belonging. So yeah, I don't know. My mind was sort of going into this idea, because I mean, when I talk about the West, also, I mean, I always feel like I have to put like a caveat. It's like it's the hyper-real West. Of course, like all of these, like West, North, East, South, they're all contested locations on a moving scale. The center of the map is the person who draws it. But yeah, there is this idea of the hyper-real West, and if you grow up as a post-colonial subject, this concept is shoved down your throat. It isn't kind of I don't know. I feel like can we create a sort of imagined archipelago in the sense of like imagined communities, which perhaps are stronger than geographically enforced ones.
That's a really beautiful
also,
proposition. Oh.
With imagined communities, you also, I guess, obliquely reference Benedict Anderson, right? But for Benedict Anderson, he was discussing the imagined communities of nation states or of emerging nation states first and foremost. But you are hinting at different transnational or archipelagic imagined communities, I suppose.
I mean, I think, I mean, in my reading of imagined communities, there was this, it wasn't a total refusal. There was still this sort of respect for this idea of like the kinship that is built. And what I find really interesting is like how he talked about how imagined communities are built with the shared press.
Yes.
So like how print, he was talking from another time, but yeah, how print media sort of written in a similar language actually was able to connect and create this sense of shared community through propagated cultural signifiers. So
yes, the public sphere of the nation state. But I'm also reminded now of this other brilliant book by Benedict Anderson, Under Three Flags, which is in a way also about the Philippines as ground zero, which is about these anarchist activists and authors, writers in the late 19th century, who of course also used the infrastructure of empire, right? They used the infrastructures of transportation, of travel, of print. And maybe to return once more also to this constellation of two different types of interventions in Facebook, if you will, of this contemporary infrastructure. So we have the collective organic troll farms, the rice paddies, and we have the collectivized Facebook campaign. Can we think of these as being sort of two levels of activity? Can we actually also consider collectivized Facebook as a form of trolling? I mean, it is at this moment a proposition that is put out there that doesn't seem to be, let's say, immediately applicable. Are these complementary approaches? I'm wondering what the two of you have to say about that. Nothing?
No, you want to go first, Jonas?
I mean, I'm like hesitant to respond to the talk now that I don't have the full subtitle overview. But I mean, I was very struck by what you're by the way that you describe this incredible tension between the space of Facebook or a collective form of trolling as one that enables particularly neurodivergent queer communities to enact or engage in a multiplicity of parallel overlapping or parallel existing identities, and that in that sense you're also emphasizing the liberational possibility or potentiality in this infrastructure, while at the same time you are also very precisely mapping how this potentially progressive or emancipatory component has also been very effectively instrumentalized by the Duterte regime, and that you even make the genealogy to the Marcos dictatorship as laying the kind of the cultural foundation for this, and how these two exist at the same time within the same framework. Although it does feel that the way that you're describing the troll farm that you organized is one that also resists the sense of isolation, and exactly as you, and ensures a collective care for what it means to engage in the level of vulnerability of let's say non-centralized identity formation, and at the same time what it means to be exposed to the violences, the misogynist violences that you are describing, that you are counter trolling. So I felt in the way that you were speaking about it, this collective organization of the troll farm, of the counter troll farm, also resists this the isolation, the atomization, the physical atomization that users, social media users, are partially express and are subjected to, with all the kind of health and psychological damages that result from it. Sorry, it was just a response.
In a way, in your own project, the collectivization is a future perspective, right? It is, which is put out there in a sense as a meme now, right?
Well, I'm very comfortable to see it as in the way that Clara describes this practice of a kind of counter trolling or emancipatory trolling, you could say. I would be very comfortable I'm very comfortable to look at the collectivized Facebook campaign from a similar point of view, although I see that she's taking a lot of questions into considerations about the trolling as a collective practice, whereas I think Jan and me, in the end, it was the two of us with various legal advisors working for a year on an indictment that wants to create a space for collectivity, but we were not exactly collectivized yet, as we were a relatively small group ourselves in that sense. So our approach in that regard, I guess, differs.
Well, I mean, but I think that the two, it's not a one or the other. Like I think your endeavor actually is like this sort of structural assault on the platforms themselves is quite necessary. And rather than, I mean, I always talk about burning the candle at both ends. It's not one or the other. It's that we have to try everything. And we just have to throw shit in the air and see what sticks and then go there. And that's actually how they do these online disinformation campaigns. They just throw like stories in the air, make up stories, throw them up, see which one sticks and to where the traffic goes, and then be like, okay, cool, that's where we're going. So what I think is vital actually is for like, it's not about whether it should be one or the other. It's these two or multiple approaches should coexist and like be moving towards the same direction. Which I think is what the right does quite well, where there's a certain tolerance within like the differences and the differences that do exist, but it is like much less fragmented than resistance on the left. And the Philippines, for example, has a really, it's hyper fragmented, the opposition. And we're just lost in calling each other out and in, you know, engaging in these like fractionary politics when the right is actually like, cool, we all agree that we're going in the same direction, right? Well, I don't care if you're this or that, or if we disagree, it's just this agreement that we're going in the same direction. So, I mean, I find Jonas's project super exciting as well. And it's like, cool, well, you do that, we're doing this. So you have to think of like multi-scalar approaches. Yeah. And how to build coalitions and how to reinforce each other, I think is, the task at hand.
Are there maybe questions you would like to engage our speakers with?
I think it is also possible for people who are online to ask questions. So Irene is in charge of that.
Just feel free to speak up. We should be able to hear you.
Sure. Clara, you mentioned that you invited the trolls into your home. What kind of experience was that for you? What kind of people become trolls? And did you discover that you were empathetic towards the trolls, and why they became trolls?
Shall I, Clara, did you get that, or shall I repeat the question? Did you hear it? Yeah? Okay, great.
Well, the trolls that I invited to my house were friendly trolls, so like trolls on my side. So I knew some of them, and some of them were not trolls. Some of them were just friends who came over because I was doing something weird in my living room. So that was like a different experience, I think. But actually, with the troll that I was mentioning in the subtitles, the sort of my troll nemesis who teaches in Maastricht, actually met up with her. She messaged me when I had already moved to Rotterdam, and she asked me, yeah, to go have lunch. And she mentioned that she wanted to do performance art together, like Marina Abramovic, Ulay style, like we're sitting across the table and staring at each other. But it was quite interesting, actually, like when we were sitting across the table from each other, and we had a very long talk, like 4 hours. And I found that her physical presence, and that's why like the body is so important. It really like being present in a room changes completely the atmosphere. And it was really funny because when, you know, she was talking and then she was telling me this, like we were super similar. I think we were so surprised at how maybe in another universe we would have been great friends. And like, but yeah, I was having this like reaction to her when she was like being unable to see her from a hostile standpoint when she was sitting across from me. And then the minute she would go to the bathroom and be like, no, 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 like, yeah, just this like a distance of a few meters and her not being in front of me was, yeah, interesting. We haven't talked since, and it's not like, yeah, I'm not going to keep her accountable to the things that she's done and continues to do. But yeah, I feel like, and I've been consulting with anthropologist friends in this whole process, and they were telling me like, be careful with wanting to save the subject and don't enter into this ethnographic, because it's like ethnography of me and then ethnography of, she is kind of like my figure, my figurehead, I guess, my muse. She's my muse. And there is this, I think, deep down desire to, yeah, of all, I think I focused on her because I'm like, well, of all these, she's like a she used to be like a gender rights activist, active in the squatting scene and anarcho-communist, like before something happened to her in the Netherlands and she went to like in the completely opposite direction. But I think despite myself, there is this wish to bridge and to have her come back. So there is this tenderness, I think.
Do you think, sorry, but do you think that's mutual? Do you think there's this kind of wish on her part?
I don't want to speculate, but I will, like in my kind of amateur psychobabble. But I do think, yes, like she also had this moment with somebody else, so she has many nemesis. And she had this moment with somebody else where they kind of reconciled, and he told her that maybe she should start contacting other people that she had kind of problems with, and that's why she contacted me. So I do feel like there is this wish to, yeah, she does get a lot of abuse also from people on her side because she's trans. So there's a, yeah, I think there is, I don't know. In the end, I'm not trolling to change her. Like I'm trolling for the people on the fence, the people who are silent, the people who are watching, the way that I was watching during Duterte's campaign and not saying a single word, but I was watching. And it's really, I don't know. I think it's for the fence and for the people who are vulnerable. I mean, if you're outside of your echo chamber, the number one danger is neurolinguistic reprogramming. So you have to really be conscious when you're outside of your echo chamber and be constantly aware of the fact that these multiple impressions are making an effect. And I've had moments where I'm like, hold on, I'm being brainwashed in real time. So yeah, it's just the single voice that's saying no, this is not correct, or this is not a fact. Like forget correct, let's talk about facts. And I think even just one voice in the trenches, which are the comment feeds, if Facebook is the battlefield, then the comment feeds are the trenches. And not everybody is suited for trench warfare. But yes, just to have a single impression and a single voice saying, no, that is not a fact, it's useful.
Mm-hmm. Do we have other questions, comments? If not straight away, maybe if I could quickly follow up on, you emphasized the importance of basically fact-checking in real time and the importance of a voice saying, no, this is not correct, which, I completely agree with. I totally see that, of course. At a certain point, you also mentioned something about, making up this and that, and then see what works or what gets traction, right? I mean, how does sort of the fact-checking, the saying, no, this is not correct, this is not true, relate to what you seem to be hinting at that moment, when it seemed to be about seeing what kind of narrative, basically, or what kind of, I won't say fiction. I'm not quite sure what you were hinting at, actually, but you were saying, well, making up lots of shit and then seeing what gets traction. Could you perhaps sort of elaborate a bit on that?
I guess I was talking about like the disinformation factory, so the fake news essentially, and using, which was very essential in Cambridge Analytica's strategy, was to create a target fake news towards people who they felt that they could, so people who were, by the data that was there, people who they felt they needed to, so either you either radicalize with fake news, or you basically you radicalize, you bring people off the fence, and you do that with falsehood and with have fact, have fiction. That's what I meant by.
I wasn't quite sure whether that sort of applied purely to, let's say, the enemy, the Cambridge Analytica trolls, or whether you also see some room for this in the activity of, let's say, white hat trolls. Or is there a clear division of labor, let's say?
Yeah, I think what's, I mean, on the opposition, and not just me, like, people who are memeing and like, actively involved in memetic warfare as well, and they're using fact. They're doing fact checking, and actually Wikipedia is the only place that has given me hope. The talk pages on, if you go into like certain contested pages, and if you go into the talk page, so that's the editing, that's the place where the editors like talk to each other and discuss corrections. And the really strict format and guidelines of Wikipedia on what is considered fact. Like, so they require you to, or it's preferable for writing on Wikipedia to be sourced or referenced to secondary sources. So not primary sources like eyewitness reports and stuff, but people who are writing about. There's that, and then there's no original research. So this idea of fact having to be sourced elsewhere is actually quite, it's oppressive in some ways and for some considerations and situations, but in fights in historical negationism, it's actually quite helpful. At least it has been in the Philippine context. So one of the projects that we are now still doing with an archive in the Philippines is actually digitizing old, because a lot of this, the Wikipedia wars are generally around Marcos and the Marcos history. So that's a battleground that the Marcoses were very connected to Duterte, by the way. We've been digitizing Mosquito Press stuff. So Mosquito Press was like the freedom presses that came up in the Philippines when there was no press freedom during martial law, and there were only 3 state-sanctioned newspapers. So from the ground up, and like people started running Riso Press newsletters and stuff like that to report on what was happening in the ground, and this was called the Mosquito Press. So Francisco Tata, the disinformation or the information minister or whatever he was called, used the mosquito term as an insult, and it was like, oh, they're pesky, and it's all buzz and no fact. But it was sort of taken on as a badge of pride, and I think maybe because of this idea that you can never kill all of the mosquitoes. Digitizing these and these and other sources that are kind of sitting in archives with not so much public access, and making them available online so that people can write and can have these sources is important. And in the talk pages, as I was saying, like when a page becomes like an edit war, where there's an edit war, then the page gets flagged, and then senior editors are called in from other places to kind of mediate. And the way that they enforce the Wikipedia rules actually nullifies or deadens, or like in many cases it has neutralized the disinformation trolls. So yeah, I think Wikipedia is the one place where I'm like, oh, fact still lives. So that's why I find it's really an important battlefield as well. And like, we don't have a history of sorry, anyway, I'll shut up. Jonas, you talk.
Jonas, you want to pick up on this?
I was making very active notes. So it was a great. I think to maybe also refer a little bit back to the earlier to your earlier presentation, Clara. I thought this testing ground, or what you call ground zero, is really crucial. And I would reference Siva Vaidyanathan, who wrote Anti-Social Media. It is about the history of Facebook and what Facebook is, and also where the 2.5 billion users came from. And what Clara was mentioning, the so-called internet.org or free basics campaign, that was essential to be able to access the internet for free, but only through Facebook as a browser. It was an attempt to completely replace the idea of the internet for the idea of Facebook. And that was the, I mean, as Clara said, that was the battleground in the Philippines, but also Zambia, Ghana, Guatemala, Myanmar, where the prosecution, where Facebook played a crucial role in the mass murder of Rohingya Muslims. So this is the kind of, this is the geopolitical back end, which very problematically indeed is continuously mediated through figures like Trump, or maybe Bolsonaro, who is then also immediately called the Trump of Brazil. And in that sense, we're only engaging with that historical genealogy and the intersection between the rise of alt-right and authoritarian regimes and parties across the world and the digital infrastructure, only referring to it through the front end. Through a front end which is still relatively dominated also by mainstream media outlets, who are only capable of understanding figures like Duterte or like Modi as the doubling of Trump, whereas actually it is, as Clara was saying, exactly the other way around. So I think that is a really important point to make, and should also be, from the perspective of a propaganda researcher, this genealogy really is really under researched, undervalued, and to understand what is happening now, it is important to abandon this idea that it is manifesting only now, or as something that only belongs to the present, but has a genealogy, a particular genealogy in and of itself.
And yet there is also something eerily familiar, right, about biopolitical or necropolitical tools being tested in, let's say, the global south, right, and in the colonies. That in itself is an all too familiar scenario, right? And in this case, it's Facebook, let's say, as opposed to methods of other pre-digital analog methods of population control, population management, and indeed extinction and genocide. So in that sense, you know, if we say the petri dish, right, then the question is, okay, if we have the petri dish, who's running the lab, right?
I mean, if you'll permit me a bit of internet archaeology, like we're talking now about Facebook, but before Facebook there was MySpace, and before MySpace there was Friendster, which was like and the Philippines actually, or the Philippine population has always been extremely active. We are like really early adopters of all sorts of connective media. And before Friendster, there was, I mean, we were also like, I think the country that was sending the most text messages per capita in the world. Like, so in the SMS, like when it was just SMS, we were also like we were a high output, or extremely savvy with anything, any technology that is connected. So I think, and Friendster and Facebook kind of died in a way. There's like articles, there was an article on Wired that talked about this, and they died because they didn't know how to monetize this extremely large population of Filipinos that were on the platform. So Facebook's success is that it found a way to monetize this traffic. And even in like, I have friends who are like social media kind of managers in the Philippines, and they say that like BuzzFeed, for example, has a headquarters in the Philippines now. And a lot of websites, what they do when they have to hit their targets, like their traffic targets, so that they can still sell their advertising at the same rate to their clients, what they do is like Forbes and Time magazine and all these big, when they come up with a survey, or a survey that's like, you know, what are the best 10 islands in the world? And then they'll put like 2 Filipino islands on there because they know that we're going to go and we're going to vote. So we win. We always win these online polls. Best food in the world, Filipino food. So we own the internet. We understand how to mobilize traffic on the internet. So it's not like, I mean, of course, like there is this thing of digital colonialism and we are being extracted from, but I think there is extreme agency. Like we are coming up with strategies that later on are being ported elsewhere. So the key actually is to understand that we run the lab, and we have been running it for a long time. But yeah, without this awareness and without this consciousness, there is no agency.
So that's really interesting in a connection to collectivizing Facebook. We run, we own the internet, we run the lab. It's interesting.
Well, yeah, there might be a difference also between running something and owning it, right? But perhaps that's...
Yeah, I heard both, so that's interesting. However, we're wrapping up.
Yes.
It's time.
Are we running out of time? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah? I've lost all sense of time.
One really quick question, maybe? One last possibility? Sven?
Well, then let me just say, if we're wrapping up, that I'm really extremely happy with this constellation here today with Clara and Jonas, and with this constellation of the white hat troll, Palayan, and collectivized Facebook. I think this is indeed precisely an example of the kinds of resonances and constellations that I've been trying to foster. I think this does give us a lot to think about different approaches that are complementary, and yeah, we'll see what sticks, and perhaps it's precisely also the combination that will stick in the end. So thank you so much, both of you, Jonas and Clara, and of course everyone here at BAK, but in particular the two of you, for not just, you know, representing this project or reflecting on it, but for basically adding a new chapter. So
absolutely, I'm joining in, thanking. I also want to thank here in this corner, there's a remarkable tech team who made this possible. Thank you so very much. Really all thanks and admiration. Thanks for that. Thank you, Clara, Jonas. So happy to see you. I'm aware I'm still not looking you in the eyes, but next time I'll try. Thank you. Thank you all of you for coming. And just to bring this back into picture, I just want to wish you happy reading. Not that the content is so happy, but it promises a possibility to desert from this dismal culture wars. Of course, to stress, as Jonas did, the question, what do we desert into? And that's the world we are yet to build together. Is this a good way to wrap this up?
yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.